So, as we think more deeply about the importance that human interaction and the socialization process has on us and how we develop our preferences for things and our taste for things, we can start to see how it's a really meaningful component of how we become who we are today as human beings. But let's think even more deeply about this. To really sell the importance of social interaction and socialization, start thinking about what would happen if you lived in a world or lived in an environment where you completely lacked social interaction, right? I think this quote from fellow sociologist by the name of Henslin is really helpful here. He says, "Without language, there can be no culture, no shared way of life, and culture is the key to what people become," right? So really think about this. Without language, without interaction with one another, there is no shared way of life. Now, as human beings, we are social beings, which means we are completely dependent on social interactions with other individuals. We are so dependent on it that our species would cease to exist if we did not have social interaction. Now, this is a really powerful statement, but we can look at evidence that supports this claim. In fact, earlier this week, one of the first pieces of content I asked you to view was this video on a child who did not receive appropriate social interaction for the first several years of their life, right? The child I'm referring to is Danielle. Now, as you saw in the video that I asked you to watch, Danielle was a severely neglected child for the first 8 years of her life. She had very minimal, if any, social interaction with parental figures, with loved ones, with other children, etc. And as a result, Danielle did not receive the proper socialization, which prevented her from developing a sense of self. So as you saw, by the time that police and child protective services got involved, Danielle was 8 years old, but as it was mentioned in the video, she had the intellectual ability of a 6-month-old. At the age of 8, she was so severely intellectually disabled from lack of social interaction that she only had the mental capacity of a 6-month-old. And as you saw, as you continued watching the video, as years progressed, at the end of the video, Danielle was now 15 years old, living in a family that was loving and providing her with the nurture and the interaction that humans require. But due to that void of interaction, for the first 8 years of her life, those early stages of her, what should have been her early stages of self-development, that void of interaction was impossible for her to overcome. In fact, it's impossible for nearly all humans, arguably, to overcome that level of neglect in those early stages of development. And that's because when our brains develop as human beings in those early years of our childhood, right, going into adolescence, that's when our brains really grow and form and shape the sense of who we are today. So as young children, as babies, toddlers, growing into childs and even into adolescence, if we do not receive the appropriate social interactions, teaching us how to communicate, how to make sense of the social worlds that we're a part of, teaching us how to interact with others, we can never overcome that deficiency. And that was the unfortunate experience for Danielle. You could see that by the time she was 15 years old, her father said that she still only has the intellectual abilities and capacity of about a 2-year-old. And she will likely never progress beyond that due to the severe neglect that she experienced as a child. So think about that. Think of how important this is now. Put this in a broader context, right? If no individual in our society received proper interaction, right? If all children in our society were severely neglected to a point where the cycle continued to the point where no longer anyone in our society interacted with one another, nobody had the means to communicate, our species would likely cease to exist, right? There's no evidence we have that suggests that we are like a wild animal that has these ingrained, characteristics or these habits, these habitual practices that we would follow to teach us how to gather food or to naturally be inclined to reproduce, to maintain our species, right? As humans, we largely require on sufficient development of our brains. And the only way we can develop our brains is through interaction. So that's just kind of a really drastic example to prove the importance of sociology, right? Sociology, again, the study of patterns of human behavior and social interactions. Social interactions are so important because they shape who we are as humans. And without social interactions, without being taught how to develop a sense of self through communicating and interacting with others, our entire species of human beings would likely now no longer exist. All right, so let's talk more specifically about a few different theories of self-development. So from a sociological perspective, kind of a social psychological almost perspective, how do humans come to develop a sense of who we are? How do we develop a sense of me, who I am as an individual? Well, the first theorist we'll look at is Cooley, and Cooley developed a concept that he called the looking glass self, which essentially argues that our sense of self develops completely through interactions with others. In other words, we would not exist, we would not know who we are as individuals if not for other individuals, the interactions we have with others. Now, again, like I mentioned in the previous video, this is something that in America we tend to really kind of butt our heads against because we like to think of ourselves as really individualistic human beings with free will. We're completely autonomous and able to make our own decisions. But sociology, again, is going to say, slow down. Yes, you have free will. Yes, you're able to make choices, but recognize that the preferences you have for things, your ability to make a decision one way or the other, is largely influenced by previous interactions you've had with others. How did you come to develop that preference? How did you come to make that choice? Where did you learn that that was even a choice that you should be considering, right? And this argument through looking glass self is that we make a sense of self through our interactions with other people. So there are three main elements that Cooley talks about in this theory. First, we imagine how we appear to those around us, right? So whenever we have an interaction with someone else, the first thing, according to Cooley, that we think about is imagining how we appear to other people, right? Even if we're not directly interacting or communicating with someone, say we're just walking around outside campus or walking through La Palmera Mall, right? We're constantly thinking about how other people are seeing us and perceiving us, right? And to a degree, we try and control this by presenting ourselves in certain ways. You know, maybe you dress a certain way depending on what social environment you're in because you want to give off a certain look or a certain appearance to people. But we're always constantly evaluating, either consciously or subconsciously, how we think other people are viewing us. So, for example, I think others perceive me as shy. That might be a subconscious belief that I have. When I'm walking around or interacting with people in a social environment, I might think other people perceive me as shy. So I'm imagining how I'm appearing to other people, either consciously or perhaps even in my subconscious. The next stage, according to the looking glass self theory of Cooley's, is that we interpret other people's reactions, making conclusions about how they evaluate us. So I might come to the conclusion that other people are going to think I'm boring because I'm shy, right? So I'm making assumptions, essentially, about how I think other people are going to perceive me based off of how I think they're perceiving me. So this probably sounds kind of confusing and psychological, but if you just think about this in a context of an example, it starts to make a little more sense. And the last stage of this looking glass self is that based off of our own assumptions we're making about how we're appearing to others and the conclusions we're drawing, thinking about what others are thinking of us, we end up developing a self-concept. So our interpretations of others' reactions, or at least our expectations of what we think other people actually are thinking of us, actually frames how we come to feel and define ourselves. So, if I think other people perceive me as shy, and I make the assumption that when other people think I'm shy, they also think I'm boring, I might develop a negative self-concept of myself and think poorly of myself. I might think that I'm a loser or that I'm no fun to be around, that I'm never going to have any friends because I'm such an introvert because other people think I'm boring because they think I'm shy. Now, is this really what other people are thinking when they see me in a social interaction or in a social environment? Doesn't necessarily matter. It's my perception about what I think other people are perceiving of me that's affecting how I come to define my self-concept, right? So this is Cooley's theory of the looking glass self. We develop a sense of self based off our interactions with other people and even based off of our perceived interactions with other people, how we think other people are interpreting us. So Cooley's concept of the looking glass self argues that our sense of self develops from others, interaction with others. How does this concept of looking glass self relate to the concept of the sociological imagination? Well, we might consider how the sociological imagination is this interplay between seemingly individualistic decisions in larger social structures in our society, right? So again, as individuals in American society specifically, we're really taught to think that we completely are in control of who we are and who we identify as and our sense of self, but Cooley's theory of the looking glass self really kind of encourages us to take a more structural look to things, right? To consider how the social environments that we're a part of, the institutions or organizations that we participate in, the places, the environments that we interact with others in, really have a significant role in shaping our sense of individuality and how we even come to view ourselves. How that's all really affected with these interactions we have with other individuals and other social structures in our society. So the looking glass self, I think this is always a really helpful graphic to think about, in every different social interaction, every different context that we interact with people in, we likely perceive that they think of us in a different way, right? So for example, how my mom and dad see me. Well, maybe when I'm around my parents, I try and be a goody two-shoes, right? Maybe when I go to grandma's house, grandma thinks of me as her little angel because whenever I'm around my grandma, I'm really consciously thinking about how I'm presenting myself when I'm interacting with her, I don't swear around my grandma, I say please and thank you whenever she talks to me, I sit and listen really intently when she talks to me about the things that she did earlier this week, right? So you try to really come across in a positive way, and that affects your sense of self. You might feel really good about yourself or feel like you're a good grandson or granddaughter or grandchild to because of those interactions you have with your grandparent. Now, how does your girlfriend or your significant other see you? Well, maybe the way you interact with your significant other is a little more romantic, a little more sexually driven. So when you present yourself in interactions with your significant other, maybe you try and come across a little more cool, a little more alluring or, sexually attractive. And that affects how you interact with that individual. And it also affects how you come to feel about yourself, right? And how you choose to present yourself in those interactions. How your older brother sees you, right? Maybe if you have an older brother and they pick on you all the time, your older brother makes you feel pretty insignificant, right? Maybe they bully you and they make you feel less than or smaller than what you really want to feel. But nonetheless, those interactions you have with your brother also subconsciously affect how you come to view yourself. Maybe every time you come across an older male figure in your life, you automatically feel these feelings of lower self-worth stemming from these interactions, these negative interactions that you've had with an older sibling. And then this last one, how my ex-girlfriend sees me, right? So maybe things didn't end well with you and your previous significant other, and they start really trash talking you on Snapchat and on Instagram. And now every time you see or hear of your ex, you have these really negative or angry feelings about yourself. You're angry that you even wasted time in that relationship, and it makes you start feeling like a more aggressive version of yourself that typically you wouldn't be. So in every different context of every interaction, the development of self is affected by how we interact with others. Now, it's important to note that according to this theory, the development of self does not actually depend on accurate evaluations, right? Our ex maybe doesn't think we're that bad of a person, but in our mind, we have this image built up that our ex absolutely hates our guts and wants us to die, right? So maybe that affects how we view ourselves and develop a sense of self, even if it's not an accurate representation of how other people perceive us. So another example, while I came to the conclusion that people dislike me for being shy, perhaps people find that trait about me something that's enduring and humble. So instead of me coming to this conclusion that other people think I'm boring and therefore I'm a loser and have a negative sense of self because I'm shy, perhaps it's actually a trait that some people find positive in some aspects. So it's not always dependent on how accurate our interpretations of others' perceptions of us are. It's just how we perceive people. So in that sense, we do have a good degree of autonomy about how we develop our sense of self, If you're someone who's really good about blocking out the perceptions of other people or not being heavily influenced by what other people think, you probably do have a pretty authentic sense of individualistic self. However, the majority of us being social beings are really dependent and really care about what other people think of us. So regardless, the misjudgments we make become part of our self-concept, and while we begin developing a self-concept in childhood, it is a never-ending process. We are constantly evolving and developing our sense of self.